All right, so let's move. As I say, thank you so much for um, joining us for Vega Views this week. It is a series of conversations. I will be hosting you this evening. I'm Michelle O'Hara. I'm the Deputy Dean in the Brand Communication, Brand Management area, with responsibility primarily for our postgraduate degrees, our postgrad diploma programs in brand building, brand strategy, and very excitingly in the space of futures thinking. And as many of you know, Vega was founded 25 years ago as a maverick brand when we realized that building a brand was more than just marketing and advertising. And so we have developed as a specialist school. And we've always adopted a human-centric approach to what we do, a design thinking approach, but with a consideration always of what is going to be required in 5 years' time when our students graduate. So we've always had that type of mindset. And whether those students are school leavers or whether they are individuals working in industry, we've been very mindful of possibly a relatively short-term future. And so it gives me a huge delight to be able to welcome Bronwyn Williams this evening. Bronwyn, if you'd just like to, there we go. Thank you so much. Bronwyn, as you will have read from her bio, maybe some of you didn't have time to go in detail, but Bronwyn is a polymath. She challenges assumptions about the present, assumptions about the future, assumptions about all sorts of things. So Bronwyn is a world-renowned futurist, economist, and business trends analyst. Incredibly privileged to have Bronwyn share her time with us this evening. And Bronwyn has over a decade's worth of experience in strategic management, trend research, and strategic foresight, and has co-authored several books. The Future Starts Now, one that I spent my weekend, a couple of weekends ago, devouring the future, 80 key trends for South Africa. I'm going to wave it around, Bronwyn. It's awesome. It's a book that every South African should be reading. Bronwyn's also a columnist for several business and technology publications, a sought-after media commentator, and you will frequently hear Bronwyn on CNBC Africa, ENCA in South Africa, etc. Bronwyn is a partner at Flux Trends and did co-author this particular publication with Dion Chang and Faiza Khan also. So very well known and connected, but an associate at futurist.com, qualifications in marketing management from UJ, economics from the University of London, foresight from the University of Manchester, future studies from Stellenbosch, and a master's in applied economics from the University of Bath. And seeing as Bronwyn always looks as if she's about 18, I don't know where you fit all of that in, as well as consulting to clients on the top 40 JSE listed companies, South African Reserve Bank, Dubai Future Forum, various government departments, global business leaders. And Bronwyn is a member of the Association of Professional Futurists and a volunteer with the Millennium Project and an advisor at the Lifeboat Foundation and a Futures Fellow with UNDP. So Bronwyn, I think, again, you know, it's just incredible that we have the opportunity to be with you this evening. So thank you very much. I'm not sure if you'd like to add to that intro in any way before we start our conversation for the evening.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Michelle. If anything, I'd like to take something away. I mean, if you have a long bio like that, it probably means that you're not that important. If you're really important, then you just have a first name, never mind a last name and a long bio. But thank you very much. Nonetheless, I am a professional futurist. It is a real job, and it's a really fulfilling career if you approach it with an inquisitive mind, and if you are someone who likes connecting what's going on in the present and the past into what could be possible in the future. And that's hopefully what we're going to talk a bit about today.
Fantastic. Bronwyn, at Vega, where we're looking at building brands, we don't see strategy and creative as silos. We see them working together, hand in hand. We want to develop creative strategists who can think innovatively. And we are looking at creatives who are thinking strategically. So why does the world need more creatives and strategists thinking about the future?
Well, it's a great question. And it's also a topic that I've done quite a lot of talking about, because where does the future come from, right? The future is nothing other than the sum total of all of our choices put together, right? And how do we make choices as human beings? Well, we make choices based on the information that we have at hand, yes, but we also make choices based on the emotions and the assumptions that we have about where we are headed, right? So the easy examples there was most of you are old enough to remember the COVID days and the great toilet paper crisis of the year 2020, when they all told us we were going to be locked down. Everyone ran to Pick and Pay and Checkers and Woolworths, depending on your budgets, and everyone bought up all the toilet paper because nobody wanted to be caught short without that. But we created a toilet paper shortage by doing that, because we bought more than we needed, we hoarded, we acted out of a sense of fear, but we acted out of the stories that we believed were going to play out. So the point there, very simply, is that our expectations about the future have a material impact on the choices that we take, and those choices in turn determine where we're going to end up. And that means really that people that can change our expectations are the most powerful people in the world. And then we can just start to take another step back and say, where do our expectations about the future come from? Well, they come from the stories that we tell each other. The stories that, like when the president or when the minister of finance gets on the news and tells us stories about what the economy is going to look like, they are nothing that but stories, because the future hasn't happened yet. The past has happened, and they base those stories on some of the things that have happened in the past, but they also base those stories on what they want you to think about the future, because economists and policymakers are very well aware of that little secret that I've just shared with you. Your expectations change the future. So they tell very deliberate stories in order to change your behavior. And of course, businesses do this too. You are literally studying advertising or strategy or marketing. You know that. You fundamentally do believe that the stories we tell can change people's behaviors. And maybe the stories you're telling are stories designed to get people to buy more of product A instead of product B. But maybe the stories you're telling are selling bigger ideas, like the sorts of society that we want to live in, the sort of country that we want to be a part of. And we can have examples there too. We can talk about the much criticized, sure, and you're welcome to criticize it, but the story that got us from the pre-apartheid days to the post-apartheid days in South Africa without a massive civil war. Yes, there was violence, there was bloodshed. Apartheid was ended with a great amount of human sacrifice. But most of the rest of the world thought South Africa would descend into much more anarchy, chaos, and destruction, like many of our neighboring countries did. But we had a story that kind of got us from there to here, or at least part of the way to here. And that was the story about the concepts of things like the Rainbow Nation and the messianic figure of Nelson Mandela. These were stories that shaped our future and that are still shaping our future going forward. Again, we can criticize those stories, but we can't deny that those stories changed our behavior, got certain groups in our society to agree to things that they wouldn't have agreed to otherwise if they didn't believe that that story was possible. But of course, just like with advertising, the sorts of stories that we tell, they should be inspiring or encouraging to change behavior in the way that we want it to change. But they also have to be credible. You know, you can't just outright lie to get people to do stuff if it's not at least a credible lie. And that's why we do need more creative people talking about the future, because we're all selling something. We all have an idea of what we want and what we don't want. Maybe we can't articulate what our goals are exactly, although future studies, tools, and thinking and what mental models can help you do that. But we also do have an idea of the sorts of things we want more of, the sorts of things we want less of. And if we are smart, we realize that we have a vote through our choices to inform the future that we're going to get. And therefore, we all become evangelists for the sort of future that we want to share and build with those around us. And one of the best ways we can start to evangelize is to tell better stories about the future. This is again where I come back to the world of creative and how important people who think creatively really are about leading the future. We often make the mistake of thinking that the future comes from technologists, from economists, and from politicians. But rather, those sorts of groups of people are people that have heard stories, or maybe have observed stories in the case of, say, social scientists and economists, and then perpetuated them, right? Like, look at the biggest, most wealthy, most successful businesses in the world today. Yes, they build products and they make a lot of money, but those product ideas came from somewhere. They came from observing humanity, and very often they come from the world of the arts. They come from movies, from books, from science fiction, from speculations that some might have put out as a threat, but other people have seen as an economic opportunity. But nonetheless, we have to remember that the sort of executors in our world get inspired by the stories that come from the creative classes. So take like your Elon Musk is just the absolute classic example there. None of the companies that he built have come out of his imagination. They've rather come out of articulating and actualizing the imagination of generations of writers, of movie makers that have come before. And Elon's, of course, very open about this. He's very happy to share the list of books that have inspired his worldview, his politics, his economics, and of course, his businesses. And that in turn means that you people who produce new words and new pictures that inspire new thoughts have a responsibility, whether you are willing to take it on board or not, to put out the sorts of stories, the sorts of words, the sorts of pictures that you want to see other actors act upon. And that would be my sort of opening sermon as to why thinking about the future is critical for creative people, but also how important creative people are into actualizing the world that we all find ourselves a part of.
Wow, thanks, Bronwyn. I think obviously you've touched on the value, but as with any skill, it requires an investment. And so why should brand strategists, business strategists, creatives, in fact, anyone, because we are all going to experience a future. So why should we invest in developing those foresight skills? What added value does it provide not only to oneself, but one's business, one's clients, and importantly, your career?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think about the value of foresight skills and why you might want to invest in this. I think it's important to preface these sorts of conversations with the observation and the reality that, as I hopefully explained earlier, we all are already futurists in that we already have a stake and an active role to play in the future, whether we choose to use that agency or not. We also have brains that are naturally predictive machines. We know we can catch a ball even though we're not actively thinking about it, because our brain can predict where that ball is going to be. We are constantly making assumptions about the future. Even the act of getting out of bed in the morning is an act of futurism, an act of actualizing your future. You can choose to stay in or you can choose to get up, right? It's all of these sorts of choices mean we are already futurists. So why then is there a value in investing in education in this space? And that's why it's also important to note the difference between futurism and foresight. So foresight is, of course, the more academic way of approaching the future. So trying to approach it in as, and I hesitate to say the word, as scientific a way as possible. So seeing the future, the study of the future, what is possible, what is probable, and what is preferable, as a social science that can be understood by understanding those dynamics that I've spoken about, the neuroscience of how our brains work, the mechanics of the way our economy and our politics and our marketing and our advertising work. Those are all things that can be studied by social scientists who generally look at it from the present back. Most study is done on the past and how it affects the present. So it's observed and it's reported from the past and the present. But there's still, of course, the huge things at stake in the future. And that's why thinking more directly and learning how to approach, how to think, and how to influence the future with as much rigor as possible by understanding cause and effect, by learning to notice signals and seeds in the present that could interact on the future, by developing practices and language and vocabulary to better influence and guide the future becomes a huge competitive advantage. So the advantages of foresight and all the models that we can teach you in universities and courses and programs, many of them are useful, but none of them are necessary or sufficient. They rather can all help you to think about the future more directly, to understand the present more thoroughly, and to have a greater impact and influence on the future, however you define that future to be. Maybe the future in your space might just be simply the future of a brand, or even more simply, the future of a particular advertising campaign. Maybe your sphere of influence, you want to influence policymakers and regulations that could then affect the sustainability or the success of the product or the brand that you are working on. So that's another reason why you want to learn how to invest in this language and in these frameworks that can help you better gain control of the future as much as you possibly can. Not that you can ever control anything, but you can be more prepared, have more anticipation, and have more control than someone who isn't thinking systemically about how the present could roll into the future. So it allows you to be more prepared, more directed, and more proactive and less reactive than if you were just engaging in foresight naturally on a kind of ad hoc basis. So you can kind of think about it as all the tools and models that will be taught in a formal foresight program can be very comparable to how going to gym or doing exercises could be compared to just naturally living in your body. Sure, you can use your body and you can get by just fine, but by adopting certain exercises, you can learn to strengthen certain muscles and to change the shape of your body to the shape that you would like it to be. Much the same way, by adopting tools and frameworks that people have used and perfected over time, you could be more directed about shaping that future in the way you want it rather than just letting it sort of organically emerge. So it's all about having more agency over whatever domain you want to have an influence on the future. And there's one last point I'll make there, and that is how these skills taught in foresight and future studies programs can not only help your career and can help the brands and businesses you work with, or to a larger extent, your countries and societies if you want to scale up to the political level. They can also help you develop mental models of resilience and foresight and anticipation and agency over your own personal life, right? And that's, of course, what is so critical, because your personal future is, again, the result of the choices that you make. And are you making those choices with as much knowledge as possible? Are you stress testing those choices against possibilities and probabilities in all the ways that you can? These sorts of tools and techniques that are packaged into a foresight program can help you be more directed and feel more confident about the choices that you make for your own personal life.
Thanks, Bronwyn. One of the trends that I found particularly interesting in your book is what you call career cushioning and juggling portfolios. Now, we have seen in education, in tertiary education, over the past few years, we have seen institutions adding PG-DIP, postgrad diploma programs in specialization such as future studies, etc. So we've seen many of these PG dips added, is there a relationship in terms of, or a correlation in terms of adding these PG dips, etc., to the undergraduate program you already have? So would a career in foresight or futures be a very specific direction that you need to move in, or would acquiring these skills add, and as you've already said, I think it adds value to wherever you are. But if you're looking at a career in foresight or future specifically, what does that look like?
Yeah, so you make a very valuable point there, that the skills that you can learn from foresight can be applied anywhere. So we see more and more organizations instilling foresight skills and training programs among their entire staff complements. So much like Michelle was mentioning earlier, the likes of design thinking is something that's taught to accountants and to IT managers, as well as to literal product designers. Because these are thinking tools that can make you just better and more proactive and less reactive in whatever task that you're in. So many people do end up on these programs, quite often sponsored by corporations, but often self-directed too, for personal learning and development to enhance their own career, right? To make you a more valuable semi-generalist or T-shaped person, right? Which becomes more important as our careers become less defined and linear over time. These are kind of evergreen skills. It's not a skill set like learning a particular computer programming or code that could become redundant because nobody's using whatever, say, JavaScript in a few years' time. These are skills, life skills that can be useful anytime, like a design thinking, like management, like leadership, like change management. These are sorts of skills that everybody should be refining just to be as good as you can at your job. But of course, then there are a few people that want, like myself, to be a professional futurist or to be a professional foresight practitioner, which is slightly different from being a futurist. And to do that, the hardest thing is to get some sort of degree of credibility. And therefore, it is very important to, if you want to take a career in this space seriously, to make sure that you have done the due diligence to understand the jargon, the terminology, the practices, the models that work, that your competitors will effectively be using. Now, when it comes to a career in professional foresight, many of us work for ourselves as independent consultants like I do, but other people are increasingly being employed by companies. There's been a remarkable surge in companies hiring chief foresight officers alongside their HR and IT and tech and finance in that C-suite, because companies are realizing the importance of foresight as a survival and sustainability essential. And quite often then, those chief foresight officers are being recruited out of marketing departments and out of creative departments because they want someone who can challenge the status quo, someone who's not going to be coming up with the same points that the financial manager is looking at, because of course the CFO is looking at the present, he's looking at the detail, whereas a chief foresight officer is looking at the bigger picture, the broader picture, everything else but the detail, or how the details all connect across portfolios. And that sort of cross silo functionality is one of the growing sort of trends we've seen in terms of the jobs that are still available in corporate organizations. So I hope that goes some way towards answering your question there.
Absolutely. And I think, again, it's a relatively new field, as you said, the chief foresight officer, we don't see that many, but we are seeing a significant increase in the number of those positions, particularly globally, but also in South Africa, we're starting to see this really take hold. Bronwyn, what excites you the most about the future of business, the future of brands? And what frightens you the most about business leaders who are not buying into foresight?
Yes, I suppose if you wanted to talk about business in general, what scares me and what excites me is a basically the same thing, which might sound like a contradiction, but hopefully I can reconcile that. What I find exciting is increased competition, which drives more productivity and more innovation. So we are seemingly moving back into an innovation cycle, whether you're looking at hard technology or soft technology, or even creativity. We're seeing like a resurgence from the great stagnation that we've spoken about of creativity and innovation. We've been in a holding pattern for a while. But at the same time, what scares me about the future of business is converse lack of competition and other spaces, right, in the center, where the forces of globalization and automation are tending towards winner takes all, biggest companies dominating industries. I mean, we all know the examples there and how that's a force that we see. But I'm still excited about the competitions now taking place on the sort of tail ends of that sort of bell curve of success. Yeah. That's where new innovation comes from, and that's where the sort of the slowdown and status that comes from homogenization and consolidation can be challenged. So hopefully that's the answers kind of both sides. And that, of course, kind of also leads towards answering the other part of your question, where you were saying, okay, what about the future of business and what can we be doing there in terms of what's exciting? Well, I think it becomes apparent then that you have to be able to spot opportunity and act on it before other people in a highly competitive space. And looking further ahead, the sorts of predictions we can make is that large doesn't necessarily lead to sustainability. And that means that where there are big consolidations, there's also potential for big change and fallout as the large incumbents perhaps get too comfortable in their space. So that's, of course, why it's also, again, very exciting to look and to apply foresight to businesses, to spot opportunities, to limit your threats, to hedge your bets, yes, but also then to act, to be that catalyst of change, acting upon the parts of the system that are becoming too heavy underneath its own weight. But essentially, the two key benefits of any good foresight or future studies practice are the ability to spot opportunities and to avoid threats faster and earlier than your competitors are. So you're able to act, as my good friend Andrew Blades, Australian futurist and military risk and crisis advisor, talks about. You don't want to be acting at the skinny point of the decision-making point of cheese when all your options are run out. You want to be able to make a decision at the fat point of the wedge of cheese. In other words, today and not tomorrow. Because as time goes on, although future possibilities fan out, the actual future converges on the future that we all have to end up sharing.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I think, incredibly exciting to even share the little bit of information that you've shared with us, but so valuable this evening. I know we have relatively short period of time, and we are fortunate to have Bronwyn joining us as one of our lecturers on our program. But we do have about 15 minutes for Q&A. If there are any of our delegates this evening who've joined us, and does anyone have questions you would like to ask Bronwyn? Okay, in the chat, Bronwyn, what are your thoughts around sustainability versus adaptability?
Okay, so the way to answer that is that adaptability is a way to work towards sustainability, right? This is not a choice that you're going to make, but rather you're going to try to be adaptable in order to survive for longer. I think perhaps a better distinction to ask is, what's the difference between a business or an organization or a system or a country that sees survival or defense as the goal? In other words, just survival, or a sort of business, society, organization, entity that sees change, growth as the goal, right? So the one strategy is more conservative, at least in the short term. The other strategy is a much more aggressive, at least again in the short term. But ultimately, in order to survive, you have to adapt, as you say, which is to take on some sort of risks. Because if you aim to sustain without change, of course, you're not going to be able to sustain forever, because even if you're not changing, the world is changing. The external factors are changing, which means at some point you have to react, or as you say, adapt, in order to survive and to sustain. The other sort of alternative to that is sort of deliberate decline, which is also a strategy. Quite often business consultants will buy a business with the explicit goal of extracting value and allowing the organization to die. But then you're not really talking about the difference between, again, sustainability and adaptability there. It's a very different sort of kettle of fish. But some countries are also embracing degrowth or anti-growth policies, which are quite different, ironically, to sustainability as we see it. So there's a difference between actual sustainability and environmental sustainability and social sustainability and economic sustainability and all those sorts of things. But if you take the word at its baseline, sustainable to last as long as possible, well then yes, adaptability becomes a key element within that sustainability strategy, much like evolution is the distinction between competition and collaboration as grist for constant change to be survival fit for the environment that you find yourself in.
Thanks, Talita, for that question. Another very interesting dimension to consider. Jabulo, would you like to unmute, or you've popped your question to Bronwyn? So let me just read it. Futures describes future scenarios and what the possible futures are. But how do we influence desired futures? And what are the steps to getting different stakeholders aligned on a desirable future? And how do we apply this to business decisions? So Bronwyn, I think you have to summarize an entire degree in 2 minutes.
Okay, first of all, you say futures describes future scenarios. That's partially true, but not wholly true. Scenarios is just one way to explore possible futures, but it's certainly not the only way to explore futures, and it's not the only way to explore futures that will be taught in an academic program like this. And of course, there's all the natural foresight methods that we do anyway when it comes to exploring that potential decision space. But you come back to the point I was making earlier, which I'm grateful for, is around how do we influence desired futures? Well, I already told you the most powerful technique, and that is to change the stories. And the critical thing with changing stories that get people to change action is to give people credible hope. That's the first thing. So it has to be, hope means that tomorrow is going to be better for me than today is. And I have to believe that that is true. That is critical of any sort of vision or mission or sales pitch that you want to make to get people to influence that person's future. They have to be able to, and then critically, they have to be able to see themselves as part of that credibly hopeful picture. So it has to be credibly hopeful and inclusive. Those are the sorts of stories, visions, goals, missions that CEOs, that advertisers, that politicians have to put out if they want people to move into it. So we can take the example of the US election. I mean, come on, we're all kind of looking at what's going on there. And one of the reasons you'll see commentators saying why the Democrats managed to lose a ball that they were holding against a really incredible figure that doesn't stand for much. And that's because they failed to articulate a credibly hopeful picture for Americans that they saw a place for themselves in. So you can criticize Trump, you don't have to like him, any of the rest of it, but he did paint a picture, maybe not a picture you like, but certainly a picture that his voters saw themselves being a part of and wanted to play. So that's a very sort of oversimplified example, but you'll see social political analysts made very much the same sort of stories about the last election he won too. And also, we can talk about our own politics too. I won't belabor that point too much, but the reason that we've had one party in charge of this country for so long is because nobody else articulated a credibly hopeful vision that was better than the present that we found ourselves in. That's the sort of oversimplified story. So that's the sort of first technique or tactic that I can talk about, but certainly in these sorts of programs, there are always modules on change management and on organizational design that talk about, in whatever domain or system you're operating in, there are key stakeholders that can be gatekeepers, that can prevent your vision of the future going forward, and there are people that could become enablers or co-creators of that future. And what change management is, a whole study of psychology, of how organizations work, how people interact with each other, and it's explains to you how the importance of using inclusive languages, for example, in the plans that you put out, how getting buy-in from stakeholders. And of course, one of the main things we do with foresight, and certainly in the academic practice, is to make sure that you include stakeholders throughout your planning process. So you're not just presenting those credibly hopeful, inclusive pictures, but they're actually inclusively built and made, because when people have ownership over a plan, they're more likely to participate in it. Those are sorts of basics, but there's a whole science, a whole management science around getting people to buy into what you are doing. But it comes down to telling those credibly hopeful, inclusive stories. If people don't see a path for themselves in the future that is better than their present, they're going to actively resist you. And again, you know this as advertisers. You sell things that are going to make people's lives better than they were before they bought them, right? And you have to get them to believe that that is so, even if it is ultimately a lie. I mean, that's a sort of subtext, but that's the basics of what you have to do. And how you do that, of course, there's many different techniques. It's how you're framing information, very similar to the sort of techniques you learn about how to sell a product. There's different ways to frame information. There's different language you can use. There's different processes that you can use. There's sort of tried and tested formats in terms of how many workshops you should have before a strategic planning process or a policy making process, so that everybody feels heard. There's, of course, the basic techniques of facilitation that you're going to have to learn, because that's the art of getting agreement, real agreement, not just superficial agreement, into the course that we're going to take as we go forward. But that's why I would encourage you to do courses like this, because we can talk about the principles. Sounds easy, but in practice, it gets a lot harder. And that's why you want to learn those tactics and techniques and practice them, so that you can get people to buy into visions and work together to actually actualize them.
Thanks, Bronwyn. A question from Dion. Would you describe yourself as management or a thought leader?
Well, people have described me as a thought leader. I'm certainly not management. My company is just 5 of us, and we're a very flat structure. We're a partnership, so we don't really have employees to manage, but I do work with management. And that's, of course, to go back to the previous question, one of the things that you'll learn is that the leader has to be aligned first and foremost, bought into a strategic foresight process, bought into the idea of change. Change does start from the top. So if you want an organization to shift or to change or to be useful as a consultant, you have to have leadership buy-in. You can't come in with some little manager and hope that that's going to sort of infect the rest of the organization. But that's just the first part. Thereafter, you have to go and take that leader's bought-in vision and make sure it infects the rest of the organization or everybody else that has to follow in that direction.
Okay, and just a couple of last questions. Okay, sorry, a question here. To what extent do trends in first world countries affect South Africa? And do you find they take a long time to be adopted here?
Well, of course, that's a very broad question, and there's nuances to every. It depends what trend are you talking about. But ultimately, we live in a world that is an open system. We have these arbitrary borders that we put between our countries, and we say, this is South Africa, that's not South Africa, you need a visa, you need a passport. But ultimately, information flows, it doesn't care. The internet is globally connected, even with firewalls in places like China, or now Mozambique, or, Mauritius, that now have internet blocks. Information still finds its way across borders, even when it's officially locked down, as does the climate, and as does money. The economic policy of the new politicians in the US are going to affect the price of your eggs and your bread here in South Africa. So that's a great example of how political and economic trends, they do affect us, quite often almost immediately. Sociocultural trends too. We have access to the same celebrities. Kids here go to Taylor Swift concerts. You don't have to like her, but everyone knows who she is. Of course, there's nuances within countries. But I think the more important way to answer that question is to say that actually here in South Africa, there are many things that we are world leaders in. We take our constitution, for example. The constitution is way more progressive than the actual South African is, but it was also way more progressive than other national constitutions were across the world. So in terms of gender rights, LGBTQI rights, all of those sorts of social rights, and the rights to things like to sort of intangible things like dignity. These are things that South Africa's led on that have now influenced policies in other parts of the world at a very significant level. We told different stories and then we changed our behavior and the rest of the world's behavior to sort of fit us. Again, trends in terms of things like inequality and late stage capitalism. We got there first. The rest of the world is kind of catching up to us on many of these things. So there are trends that start in all places of the world, and ultimately, because we're all connected on this planet Earth, they do affect all of us. Now, Michelle mentioned the book that we put together, the 80 key trends for South Africa. None of those trends are South African trends. They're all global trends that will have an impact on South Africa. So that's another way to answer that question directly the same way. So yes, they affect us. How long do they take to adopt? That depends whether we started them, whether they started them, and what sorts of trends they are. So take something like birth rates. Birth rates are falling much faster in other parts of the world, but they are falling here too. But it will take us another couple of generations before we have a youth decline instead of a youth bulge like we have here. But yes, those trends are still interacting on us. Why? Because more educated women don't want to have as many babies. And yeah, sure, we're poorer and we don't educate our people quite as well, but we are still educating more women every year, which means those trends do have an effect on us. But it's a hard question to answer with an absolute, because give me a trend and then we can talk through what direction it's blowing and the sort of tail length that it could have.
Okay, Bronwyn, I know that you pressed for time. There are several questions coming through. I'm just going to Michelle, who is a lecturer, so working in the education space, has asked the question, what are the opportunities for us as lecturers to bring futures thinking into our lectures, and students that we are supervising who are doing their own research, etc. Are there opportunities to get our students into a futures thinking mindset?
Well, of course, there's opportunities. There's ways to infuse foresight or natural foresight or futures literacy into whatever classes that you teach. It's about learning to question things, to notice things, to connect dots, to make those connections. Those sorts of basic thinkings, again, much like design thinking, could be applied to just about anything. We're certainly seeing more and more educational institutions from primary schools all the way through to university programs infusing futures literacy, much like you would teach children about history or about social science, which is kind of the present, right? So infusing that into our way of thinking about the world, that is a way of thinking not just about today, but also about tomorrow and my role connecting from here to there. So those sorts of things could be applied anyway. Even if you're not interested in foresight or future studies as a career or as a full-time postgraduate program, there are, of course, many short courses you could be doing too. And many of those skills, especially on the personal foresight mastery, can be taught, or at least I don't even like to use the word taught, like just like going to like a breathing conference. They don't teach you how to breathe, but they can teach you how to hold your breath or how to get more out of it. Can be done on quite short-term basis. You can do short courses on these things, learn some basic skills, get a bit more agency and a bit more confidence in your own choices and in your own decision making. So I hope that answers that. But lecturers too, you could consider going and doing a foresight course and adding to your skills backpack and to your career portfolio to be a lecturer who thinks about the future. And I think lecturers should be thinking about the future because you're informing the next generation of thinkers, right? So you're influencing the future influencers. You are changing the minds of the people who will write the stories, put out the words and pictures that are going to direct the future forward.
Thanks, Bronwyn. And we will be sharing shortly information on an incredible workshop that Flux, Bronwyn's organization, does offer. But let's just quickly, two last questions. Bronwyn, yes or no? Do you personally think that electric motor vehicles are the future? Yes or no?
No, they're an interim future. If when you do future studies, you're going to learn about a wonderful model called the 3 horizons model. So I would say electric motor vehicles will find themselves on horizon 2. So if you join the courses and you figure out what that means, we'll leave that one for future discussion.
Okay. Yeah. And then last question from David. How frequently do organizations find themselves following a preferable future? Kind of that default safe future view, as opposed to ending up following the projected future. So
Well,
why or what prevents them from preferable futures?
Well, there is a crisis of imagination there. Yes, absolutely. Organizations tend to work towards the projected future because organizations are effectively incentivized to help shareholders who are acting against their version of the predicted future rather than the preferable future. Shareholders bet on what sort of future, what companies they think are going to work in the future. And of course, they're governed by boards, and quite often boards are trained in schools of economics or in schools of business management that are trained to respond to data. In other words, to work on projections that are based on train analysis, which is based on the past, right? Extrapolating the past into the most likely future. And organizations have to make a choice onto how to act that's going to minimize risk first and foremost, incidentally, and then maximize profit thereafter. So you find organizations are just by dint of scale. The bigger the organization, the more the tendency to work towards the probable, because that's a place that executives can get into less trouble for making assumptions and taking actions on. At the same time, you do find some businesses that are headed by visionaries that tend to be the biggest, most successful businesses in the world that are based on the founders. And that's usually almost like a monarch or totalitarian kind of leader that does have a vision of the preferable future they want, and they drag the organization kicking and screaming towards that. And those are the sorts of people that seem to have outsized votes on the future, but that's because they're the ones who are creating the future as opposed to reacting to other people's futures. So entrepreneurs fall into this space, often smaller businesses that are run by someone with a vision is operating on the assumption that they've got a preferable future, they know what to work towards. And as I said, some of those big visionary, more sort of authoritarian leaders you see in politics and in companies to also act on that assumption, but they are rarer. And yet they tend to have what seems to be outsized success in the world because they're the ones that are betting against the middle, where returns can only be, by definition, as big as the mean. So that's a little bit of kind of philosophy, but yeah, that's basically what happens. And the other part to that, of course, is that quite often organizations act on the probable rather than the preferable because defining the preferable is really, really hard. Like, just take your own life. Are you able to articulate, to envisage a preferable future for yourself? Can you see yourself in that house, if it's even a house, or is it a caravan, or is it a boat? Can you see yourself there? Who are you with? What are you doing? How are you dressed? Or is your future just more money than I had today, a bigger house than I have today, which is basically working on the same assumption as an organization trying to project the best case version of the probable future ahead. So it's hard. It's hard to articulate a preferred vision. But again, scenario planning tools and foresight tools and world weaving tools and speculative future tools can help you extend your probability interface and engage your imagination and also engage your mind as to what it is that you really want to get those mirror neurons firing you into the future that you do want then.
Okay, Bronwyn, thank you. I know that we're out of time. We could obviously spend hours on this topic. We will share information about the world weaving workshops that are offered with the people who've attended this evening, who come from many different industries and sectors. So thank you for joining us. Bronwyn, we look forward to hearing more when you do join us on our program. And thank you. If anybody would like to stay on now, to ask specifically about our postgraduate diploma in futures thinking, I'm more than happy to stay on and chat to you if you are keen. But otherwise, thank you very much to everybody. Wishing you your own preferred future, and good night. Thank you. Is there anyone on the call who would like to chat about the program? Please feel free to ask if you do have questions. Yes, Peter. Go ahead. Your mic is unmuted. Peter, for some reason we're not getting sound. You definitely have access to mic, but I'm just checking. Yeah, your mic is definitely active, but can't hear you for some reason. Okay, there. I've changed the setting. Does that help?
How's that, Michelle?
Okay, that's great. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, I am interested. I wasn't aware that you could study something to do with with futuring. So yeah, I'm interested to learn more about that.
Okay, so Peter, what we are offering, and we're launching it. We've been developing this program for a while, and the only other place offering it in institution in South Africa is Stellenbosch Business School. So it is a postgraduate diploma that we offer through our distance campus, which means you're studying primarily online. And it runs over 2 years in the evenings, but I'm not sure how familiar you are with NQF levels, but it's an honors equivalent if you do a postgraduate diploma.
Sure.
So honors equivalent, NQF 8. And obviously at Vega, we do include a module specifically on brands and brand building. And we then have individuals, we're very, very fortunate to be working with individuals like Bronwyn, other individuals who are consultants in this space.
Right.
So, it's a five module program, and you do a research module as well, because some of our students want to go on to master's studies. So it qualifies you to articulate into that space as well.
I see.
But if you are keen, pop onto our website, have a look at the fact sheet there on the postgrad diploma in futures thinking. But we'll also follow up with you. I'll get one of our consultants to be in touch with you.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Okay, it would be great to have you join us.
Thanks.
Anybody else? I have some of those Meet Geek people. I'm not sure that I can chat to them. Anybody else? I think we've mainly got note takers and AI people left in the room.
In that case, Michelle, I'll say bye-bye. Thank you for the
Okay, Peter. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Anybody else want to pop a question into chat or to open their mic? Otherwise, good night, Bronwyn. Thanks again for being with us.
Cheers. Bye.
No. All right, over and out from me. Thank you very, very much to everybody who joined us.